Pandora's Epidemic by Robert Allen Burton. Anyone who's paid attention to the news for more than a decade with any sort of objective mind has noticed patterns in what news gets reported. Perhaps the first and most important realization about the media is the prevailing amount of bad news, news that caters towards fear. Another inescapable realization about the news is that every news story must be presented as being significant in order to justify why it is to be considered newsworthy. After that comes the basic patterns in just what bad news is reported, and that pattern relates to the human psyche, which varies from person to person. Some people concern themselves with overseas conflicts and perceived threats that foreign countries present. Some people are concerned with financial instability and the possibility of an economic crash. Some people worry about the threat of a serial killer walking the street. Some people worry that a disease of some sort will ravage mankind. Some people are concerned with global catastrophes. Sometimes it so happens that a large news story arises to feed one of these fears, and sometimes it requires the diligent and creative reporters seek out and magnify a news story to keep each fear well fed. Ultimately, all of these concerns, worries, and fears, as well as many others I failed to mention, are catered to in sensational fashion by the media. The service rendered is paid for by the sponsorship of ads. These ads may run adjacent to the news stories or even be embedded within. The larger the number of people concerned with a specific story, the larger the amount of ad dollars will be focused towards it. Although the mere existence of a fear will result in articles that confirm that the fear is justified, by and large there is a certain level of balance with the news, and it is maintained by the fact that a news story must be significant in order for it to receive and maintain mass interest from the general public. The percentage of the population who has been concerned with the threat of disease has been presented with more than a dozen global threats in the last 2 decades. But a large percentage of the population has remained unconcerned, and one by one, each of these diseases proclaimed as a global threat has died down as being newsworthy. And even those who believe in the potential for mankind in this modern day and era to be ravaged by a disease slowly come to the realization that this quote-unquote new disease was not as life-changing as it had been reported. Then came this latest so-called new disease, which was given the name the coronavirus. It began much like the disease news stories that came before it until the president ordered a nationwide lockdown. The lockdown order coincided with the beginning of spring break, a time when the #1 tourist destination in the world becomes Mexico. Mexico, the nation with an international export named Corona beer. And Mexico, the nation that thus far still has not taken Trump's demand that they pay for the building of a wall seriously. Meanwhile, the disease itself, which symptoms match in all ways the symptoms of a strong flu, was attributed to China. Thus, a slowing of imports from China also became justified immediately. Suddenly everyone, whether they were prone to consider disease stories as important or not, suddenly had to pay attention to this one because now, whether they wanted it to or not, it did have an impact on their life. The president at this point passed the microphone to the leaders of the CDC and the International Health Organization to explain this disease to us better. Suddenly these organizations and the people who head them became public household figures. Now anyone who doubted the importance of the health specialist and the organizations they represented were darn well about to learn otherwise, because now they were given power to dictate just how society should live their life in light of this new crisis. The United States has long been the focal point of the world concerning all things new and entertaining. So it is unsurprising that much of the world would imitate our reaction to this report of a new disease. Quickly, the coronavirus went viral on the web. All English-speaking nations aligned with the quarantine order while hearing reports of how terrible the disease had ravaged the populations in non-English-speaking countries. Since English-speaking people cannot understand the news broadcast by those countries, we had only the reports of reports to tell us all about it. As the order for a lockdown came, so came the news that Big Daddy Trump was going to take care of all of his children here in America with a nice fat check to help see us through the quarantine. But as the spring break period passed, it turned out that getting the microphone back from the CDC and World Health Organization leaders was not going to be easily accomplished. Also, the media, who now had the whole population tuned into one story and were checking in on that story several times a day for updates, and the news media, who were reaping the rewards of record-breaking ad revenues, had no reason to want this story to evaporate like all the other disease news stories that had been previously reported. The opposing party, the Democrats, rather than criticize the quarantine as being an attack on the liberty of citizens, made it clear that liberal means something else, as they instead made the accusation that Trump hadn't acted quickly enough and was not addressing the situation as being as severe of a threat as he should. Moreover, they proposed that his relief check wasn't going to suffice because this quarantine needed to stay in place indefinitely until the time that the threat that a person might die with cold and flu symptoms was forever gone. During all of this news story benefited from the fact that we live in a global society linked by the internet. But the fact that the internet makes information globally available did present this news story with some problems. For instance, it slowly emerged that the name coronavirus was actually ignorant to the fact that coronavirus was all one word and had long been the name of a microbiotic residue, one which is attributed as a cause of the common cold, not a sickness in and of itself. In fact, it had always been knowledge that a person could carry the coronavirus without being sick. So the World Health figures who had spoken about a global health threat were forced to correct themselves and renamed it COVID-19, thus incorporating coronavirus into a new modern word to ensure that we realize it's a new thing and therefore newsworthy. Also, the prefix pan replaced the front of the word epidemic. Since pan is a prefix which means transitive, but it also dates back thousands of years to the god named Pan, whose name is the foundation of the word panic and pandemonium. Meanwhile, from lockdown, citizens watched the death counts rise, and to suggest that these numbers might be padded because there is financial incentive to report a death as coronavirus related, and to suggest that the death counts were not reliable because they didn't require actual confirmation of coronavirus testing, to point out the fact that the deaths were overwhelmingly among the elderly and people with other serious health problems, to express any suspicion that the media might be guilty of sensationalism was to be considered grossly insensitive and an asshole, and worse yet, a threat to all mankind for not being an obedient, compliant, cooperative citizen in the face of a pandemic. Now, as Memorial Day approaches, springtime weather beckons mankind to take part in the glory of nature. But individuals wishing to gather together in order to fully enjoy the glory of creation run a risk of being shamed for not living in fear. Not only their own fears, but also the constraints of fears others wish to impose upon them. It's pretty much where the situation stands today. When Trump expressed support for Elon Musk opening his Tesla plant despite county orders, it became clear that Trump would like to rebox Pandora's epidemic. But that might not be easily done. The Democrats want the opportunity to have a stimulus check sent out across the nation that citizens will have to attribute to them, knowing that Republicans are trying to block it. After all, if the economy fails during Trump's term, that is also to their benefit. And let's face it, some people may very well prefer a life of quarantine to returning to a job which they hate. Plus, the media doesn't want the most widely followed news story in human history to slip away easily, one which aligns and caters to a multitude of fears at once. Whether your fears involve financial instability, attack from another nation, global catastrophe, personal health, or suspicion of the guy walking down the sidewalk in front of your house, there is a slant on the coronavirus story customized just to suit you. The CDC and World Health Organization may never want to fade into the background from their present spotlight of fame and authority, and some doctors and nurses may not want to be discharged from the rank of warrior in the service of mankind without a V-Day celebration parade. Closing the lid on this box is going to cause yelping from a lot of people with fingers in the way. And who is going to face the outrage of so many people crying victim? Meanwhile, the pause button has been pushed on liberty.